Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm joining us from the Ivey Business School in London, Ontario, Canada. I am joined by three wonderful colleagues. First to my left is Mische from Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame. Next is Paula Jarzabkowski from the University of Queensland and from the City University in London, England. And last but not least is my colleague here, Oana Branzei from the Ivey Business School here in London. And today, this is our last session. We've had a two-day conversation about changing trajectories, how we can imagine and make more desirable futures. So we wanted to share some of our conversation that we've been having over the last 2 days with you in the audience. So I will have a chat function open. We'll try and save the last 15 minutes for questions from the audience. But before then, to get us started, I want to ask each of our panelists, really, how are futures coming up in your work? And if I could start with you, Anne.
Sure. So I've been interested in futures for a long time. When I started grad school, way back when, I won't date myself, but my first job was as an intern in a project called the Project for a Science of Hope. And so I was reading all sorts of sources on the psychology of hope and the theology of hope, the philosophy of hope. And, I was in grad school for sociology as well. And we were wrestling with how do you study hope as an emotion? If you study it scientifically, do you kill it? But how do you actually study something scientifically and its effect historically? As I went on in grad school, I became more broadly interested not just in hope, but other kinds of future projections. So I did some theorizing about the ways, like what is the length of our projections into the future? How far into the long-term, medium-term, or short-term do we project? What is the breadth of possibilities we consider? With what clarity do we envision the future? How is it peopled with different kinds of relationships? And currently, I am working on a research project on the use of scenario thinking in social change efforts, public interest scenario thinking in social change efforts related to democracy, development, peace building, and climate change, as I talked about some of our meetings in the past few days. And I am particularly interested in the way in which people, groups, collectivities, different kinds of stakeholders wrestle with dilemmas about the trade-offs related to the futures. Like if you're trying to, engage in economic growth strategies, how do you consider factors related to democracy or social inequality, inclusion, the environment? So how in this realm, the kind of middle range of politics, how you wrestle with the fact that you can't necessarily have everything that you want or desire or hope for. And so how do you wrestle with limits and constraints on possibilities at the same time if you want to think outside the box and be inventive about what could happen in the future?
It's great. So really looking at that hope and then the dilemmas and trade-offs. Paula, how about you?
Yeah, so I study how a combination of increasingly extreme weather from climate change, the fact that we already have significant urbanization in highly exposed areas, and also that we've got this lot of legacy assets, those things have come together to create a declining physical resilience of people's homes in the face of this extreme weather. But at the same time, that thing is eroding the insurance market that we assume is there to make us good after disaster. So it's undermining their financial resilience as well. And it's really made me think about the future because insurance is in fact a promissory note. It's a promise in the future to make you good for something that may happen to you. And so it's been bothering me because I see that we actually are thinking that there is a future that is out there. We're taking it for granted that this future is still there. That is actually no longer the reality for many people. And so you sort of understand the massive dissonance that that's going to create for those people when that promised future isn't able to be realized for them, and at a moment of extreme stress when they've lost their home, that kind of thing. And I sort of understand that well. Like, why are we heading so blindly into this thing? I often use the Joni Mitchell song, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." You don't love insurance, but God, you're going to miss her. So in that sense, I see it though as a practice scholar that we are making the future every single day. Future making is not something that's out there and different. We're actually doing it today. And so I kind of understand why we don't see this future we're constructing because the future is only a thread from where we are now, and where we are now is a thread from where we were in our past. So I'm really trying to use practice theory to help us think through, it's in more conscious ways to construct the stream from where we are now to where we are going to end up no matter what. I mean, we are constructing the future. There is no not constructing a future. It's just, can we bring our knowledgeability, our reflexivity to, re-engage our practice more purposefully around what might constitute a more desirable future, and a desirable future for whom, of course. And I think we'd probably get onto that a little bit more, but like, who wants what future?
Yeah, absolutely. And Oana, how about you?
Yeah, I like this emphasis on the makers of the future. And for me, it's all about, it depends. It depends. And we can make futures that are less undesirable or futures that are more desirable, but it always comes to the conditions and the conditionality we bring to future making. And we can do so through the practices, through the acts, through the strategies, through the conversations we have. But if we take it seriously that we have a part to play in the creativity, in the imaginaries of futures, we probably should also take seriously the conditions we bring to bear on those futures. You were mentioning about markets and how markets conditions the future, and vice versa. We can start thinking about the actions or the inactions we take today and how they may condition our futures, especially when it comes to extreme events, to planetary boundaries.
And how did that come up in your work? This notion of conditionality.
I like to think about it as a play between hope and hopelessness, and really this fine balance between admitting that something is undesirable, and yet we can make it less so by taking acts towards tempering, taming that undesirability, and perhaps bringing in some desirable aspects to that future. And sometimes it can be acceptance of something that is likely to happen, but summoning purpose, summoning will, summoning coalitions of the willing to make something happen, more so on our terms than less so on our terms.
So even recognizing that there's the desirability and the undesirability, right? And kind of playing with that, right? And where do these come from? So even kind of building on that. So, and we'll start with Paula this time. Perhaps, what insights have emerged from your field work and from your findings, your empirical work?
Yeah, I think the thing that is a bit concerning, obviously, is there's a profound stabilizingness in the way that we act in the world. You know, it's easier, and it's more, it makes people feel more secure that what we're doing is the right thing, and like, little things, maybe at the margins we tweak them, but we essentially profoundly stabilize what we think is the order that we know. So some of the things that I'm studying, like these disasters, which are becoming more extreme, having more profound effects on people, really driving enormous inequality and inequity, we keep treating them as if there's something random, exceptional out there. Yeah. And as long as we keep them out there, we don't have to acknowledge that we are actually sedimenting and stabilizing them into the practice we have. So we are constructing them, we are making them more profound, but we are also always treating it as if, well, it was something outside of our control. It was something, exceptional. And I think we see that, in some of the shocking things that have happened just in the last week for people around the world in terms of disasters that were not predicted, unprecedented. But, I think so it's this, how do we start shifting our way of acting in the world so that we don't keep stabilizing and recreating what we have and ignoring all the signals that actually we are actually creating something different to what we think we have. So how do we convince ourselves to start looking at these undesirable things as something that has been constructed and can be avoided? So if we think about Oana's point about conditionality, what are the conditions that we can reconfigure so that we start to see that as undesirable and we reconfigure ourselves away? And I think that also speaks to what Anne said about these dilemmas and trade-offs. To do that, we're going to have to accept that there are some trade-offs, and that means accepting that everything is not as it currently is, but, and so that's, one of my puzzles for myself, and how do I even do that in my own scholarship, let alone do that in the research that we're doing, where it's quite hard to convince people to go on a journey with you.
And so recognizing that even in the alternatives, there may be some undesirability. right?
And it
And so
will-
it's not completely avoidable.
And I think what's important in that is also leaving the now is undesirable for many people because the now is at least known. Even if the now is, getting a little bit worse all the time, the now is known. And so in that sense, I think undesirability comes in degrees. And it's, can we make something a bit more desirable that helps with the discomfort of leaving what you have now?
And how about you? How do your findings that are emerging from your work?
Well, as Oana was talking about conditionalities, and in Paula's comments right now, I was thinking about how considering futures in terms of dilemmas and trade-offs becomes important. I mean, we desire a lot of things. Like I'm a political and cultural sociologist and interested in things like democracy and equality and inclusion. It's hard to have all of those things that we desire at once. There are competing public, what we call public goods or public imperatives that are in tension with each other. And so when we're thinking about future pathways, we've got to, consider that what are the limits, what are the constraints, what are the conditionalities. So we want to steer away from the obviously bad futures, but that might involve giving up some things on other fronts. But I wanted to speak to Paula's point about the overly stabilized futures. Part of the when part of the foresight process involves the destabilization of people's assumptions about the future, is that we've got these, sometimes the foresight world, they call these the official futures. We've got our teleologies, we've got our expectations about what's going to happen. As we are trying to reimagine what could happen, it's like we have to bust open our expectations. We've got to pry the future open and start thinking about just multiple possibilities. And one way you do that is by bringing in multiple perspectives. So you want to bring into a future making process, you want to bring in people who are going to challenge your assumptions, who think that your desired future is actually going to have a bad ending, for perhaps for other people or perhaps for you yourself. So you actually have to listen to other people. The story that you want to tell, you might have to listen to other people putting an alternative ending to the story that you're telling. And that is one way of destabilizing our assumptions and expectations and beginning to consider a more full range of possibilities. Of course, that raises another issue, because if we have too many possibilities, how do we act? How do you move from the imagination of we were talking about this today, Oana, when you have the sense of exciting sense of expanding possibilities, everything is possible, but there are conditionalities, there are constraints. And so then once you've destabilized the future, how do you re-anchor it in pathways that have some institutional, social, cultural, economic, I'm a cultural sociologist, so I'm not a business school person, so I have a somewhat different frame for these things. But how do you frame that in a sense of what the real forces are in the world that will be constraining what you can do, while still maintaining the sense of inventiveness and possibility, and the ability, like Hannah Arendt talks about human freedom being in the ability to start something new. And I think we should all read more Hannah Arendt right now. But that's how do you maintain the sense of new while also speaking to the truth of some of the very bad things that are happening in the world.
And in your field work, how do you get those different voices to voice their different perspectives and tell these different scenarios and get everybody to actually listen, right? Because that would be one of the challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually lead scenario projects myself, but I've been studying them, collecting them, talking to people who lead them, and like the first tenet of scenario work is you want to get a diverse group, you want to get a heterogeneous group, so that people have their own teleologies and expectations challenged. Of course, who you invite to the table could vary.
Sure.
So some scenario projects are really about discussions among elites. Some are about discussions among ordinary citizens and residents, but who you have at the table matters. And that's where, again, power dynamics and the sociology and who is included really matters for the kinds of stories that we tell about the future, and the ability to imagine alternative pathways that attend to things like suffering or justice issues.
So got it. So looking at, so first you have to disrupt, you have to kind of break these things apart so that you can see it and then anchor them somehow. And then of course there have to be strategies for actually bringing these diverse perspectives, recognizing that will shape it as well. And Oana, how does making futures come up in your work?
And I love this discussion because there was a time when the future singular was considered to be homogeneous. And certainly as someone who has grown up under communism, there was only one undisputable future, and everyone else was in peril for their life if they disputed that future. And we are now in a much richer conversations in which futures can be plausible or impossible or possible or promissory or preferred. But I think it's also important to really consider that there are many kinds of futures too, that even as we co-inhabit a common future, we also co-inhabit different futures that are in opposition to one another, that have real trade-offs in terms of very significant survival or flourishing capabilities. And this applies to communities everywhere in the world, but especially in a time of wars and extreme events. It's important to realize it's not only that time doesn't flow evenly, but futures can be suspended. We talk about times of liminality when people are displaced. We talk about futures that are stretched or shrunk. And people make great investments into holding a future. And so there is real work, the future work that Krista, you speak about. Future making is work, and it involves many kinds of work for many kinds of people. There is not, I think, challenging those presumptions that we make. We have started by qualifying the futures, and I think it's really important to multiple qualify the future as both undesirable and desirable and look at some points of tension and conversion. But I think it's also important to disentangle some of the qualitatively different features and how future thinking and future doing and different types of future work may be qualitatively distinct depending on how people construct their own futures.
And so how do you, because I know one of the contexts that you study is wildfires, and so the world is always changing, right? So there's always a future out there, and that future is undesirable, right? The wildfires are getting worse. So how in your work do the stakeholders manage this kind of worsening? What are you seeing through that?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking this question. It is with utmost lucidity and humility that the firefighters, Laura and I study, confront the worsening of futures. Because without any shadow of doubt, they recognize the pattern. Some of those patterns are predictable, and the worsening is not incremental. It is exponential. So within the short window of our study, in less than 30 years, we have seen fire generations move from something that was easily contained to something that is out of control. And we have seen the metaphors of battling the inferno, or we have seen fires that jump rivers, fires that climb 14 kilometers into the atmosphere that they can be seen from space. And that really creates this utmost challenge in terms of what does it mean? What do we know? What do we not know? What can we do? What we cannot do in terms of the future? What can we do in the moment in which that future is twisting and changing, and which can be seconds or minutes in which the trajectory of that fire changes. But what we have learned by working with firefighters is their commitment to the windows of time when there is still time to change the future. So the conditionality of the future is something that we're learning from them. They appreciate that they are the makers who will condition the direction of a future for a community battling a fire. They appreciate that role. What they don't know is exactly the window, the time, the modality in which they will play their part in that future. So they take it upon themselves to prepare, So before worse comes, they're ready with alternative scenarios, with alternative modalities of coordination so that they can play their best part in conditioning what comes.
Interesting. So very, very grounded in the context of now, which is actually a little bit oppositional to the promissory note concept, right? So learning about futures from the ones that are actually looking at something versus trying to save something. So maybe from your work, what comes from that? Even this notion, it's a very different view of context, but very context rich.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there is they are actually already accepting that they can't make promises
Yes.
on a future that is stable, So I think that's an interesting feature of what you're saying there. And so they are reconfiguring their current practice. If you think about that, like we can give new meanings to existing practices to create change, or we can actually reconfigure our practices around what we think is happening. And there's a consciousness to your firefighters that I think is something that we can learn from, rather than blithely assuming that the things that I see today are as they have always been, and I am persisting down a track, and the promises I've made to the future will already happen, is this understanding of the future is out of our control. And therefore, I have to reconfigure my current practice in relation to what that future might be. And I think that's a really interesting feature that's come out of yours that also can speak to us as practice scholars about how do you reconfigure existing practice towards something that you have accepted is similar but not the same, is changing. Yeah.
And I loved from your presentation yesterday that you draw attention to both moral obligation and moral opportunity. And I think in this balance of the two, that we understand that there are some moral obligations that can come with mandate jurisdiction, but there are also moral opportunities. So if we take that moral opportunity, how are we going to exercise that role to precondition futures that may be not to our liking, but they're malleable, at least to some degree.
And maybe, Anne, right, you talk a lot about these dilemmas, right? So what we've just kind of been presented is a dilemma, the opportunity versus the anchoring. From your work, how does that come out?
Well, I was thinking about this idea of the reconfiguring when the ways in which you thought that you could prepare your understanding, you realize that they are just not going to work because the conditions have changed and the world is changing, and so you have to kind of reconfigure your sense of what the possible trajectories are. I mean, I think like our title for today was about changing the trajectory, right? And so in my work, I'm looking at the use of these participatory scenario methodologies to, rethink possible pathways. The idea is that coming out of these deliberations is not just like one trajectory, but it's like multiple pathways. And so like can you're not just telling a single story, but you're thinking, we don't know what's going to happen. Multiple things could happen. The fire could change direction, and we can't know where the fire is going to change. And so given the fact that there's so much contingency, not just condition, but contingency in the future, can we think about, multiple possibilities for what could happen? And we could do that in different ways. Like we could take a really speculative approach to it. We could do the utopian future. We could think about the apocalyptic future. And there's a whole, wonderful fictional literature with, I think they're really actually useful, these utopian and apocalyptic thinkings. I'm, as I talked about yesterday, particularly interested in the middle ground in between the utopian and the apocalyptic, which I think is the space, what I'm calling like the space of dilemmas, which I think is also the space of politics. But like I have it, like the example I shared yesterday is a really wonderful scenario project that was done in Kenya, just as in the late 1990s into 2000, just as Kenya was coming out of a period of autocracy, trying to wrestle with economic modernization and democracy and ethnic tension, and a group of thinkers came together to think tanks and academics, people from government, people from industry, people from human rights and civil society, and they were wrestling with, how do you do economic modernization while also attending to the expansion of democratic rights through a constitutional process? How do you have an inclusive model of development that attends to tensions between ethnic groups and kind of includes them into the policy? And so they were really, in their thinking about multiple pathways, they were, considering this tension between, let's say, economic growth versus democratic inclusion. So they do this framing. There's a sense in which there's a polarized framing between, we could do economic growth or we could do democracy. And they tried hard, to say this is not an either or. So and they came up with an alternative future, which actually you tried to overcome that kind of dilemmatic polarization. But then they didn't do the democratic deepening. They shut down the constitutional process, and they did this, heavy duty economic growth model. And lo and behold, 7 or 8 years later, in 2007 to 2008, ethnic tension erupts in violence after a contested election. At which point they went back to think about, well, where was this future that this group had considered about the importance of democracy and inclusion, as which had been neglected through this, a sense of this was an either or choice. So what I talked about is the space of politics, is in which you are actually not seeing, well, maybe you're seeing the dilemmas, but you're also seeing the negotiations and sometimes maybe the compromises and the political space at which you could work together to overcome some of these dilemmas in creative and collaborative ways.
So even tethering that to hope, right? Your first
Yes.
conversation, right? So how do you tether that directly to?
So I mean, hope is interesting because utopian thinking is a kind of a construction of hope.
Sure.
But it's like a hope which is kind of decoupled from the now. Literally, utopia means not now.
And I recall you saying yesterday, when they gave them the utopian version, they're like,
yeah, there was a utopian future that they didn't actually
buy into,
in a sense that there was a very negative future, but the negative future is actually useful.
Yeah.
Because this is what will happen if we do not attend to both not only economic needs, but also democracy, inclusion, inequality, and other emergent problems. So sometimes you have to pass through the imagining of the negative and that imagining of the collapse. And we talked about this, Oana, the imagining of the collapse in order to kind of rediscover a pathway forward, to rediscover a sense of hope. So it's not like, hope versus despair. Sometimes it is like the passing through the feared future that allows you to begin to commit. I mean, there's the ethical question as well, the ethical question to commit to doing the negotiations and sometimes the compromises necessary to work towards that more hopeful future.
And does that come up in your work as well, Paula, this notion of passing through, or what are the stages you need to go through? I felt like that came out in the presentations we did yesterday too.
Yeah, very much. And I mean, if I may, could I speak
Absolutely.
to a little bit around some stuff that we've been doing? So one thing we did was a study of these multi-country risk pools. And the whole point of a risk pool is that the countries join in it together for a long-term protection against, so you have to stay in this pool in order to be able to reap the benefits when disasters happen. But of course, people can leave at any time. There is no obligation to remain in these things. And so they always look really fragile. And the thing that struck us studying them is how fragile they look. And they almost always, every year, every time there's a disaster, they almost fall apart. Every year, they almost fall apart. And so if you looked at them just objectively, you'd say, wow, they're not very good, are they? Look at how unstable they are. But what we looked at is how every year they reconstruct the now, because they have to work with the people who want to leave and why they want to leave and what do you need to get today in order to make you feel like you're getting something out of it that will keep you in here for tomorrow. And we saw this kind of, they developed so many more things very incrementally. And when you look at it over a period of history, you go, my God, they've totally almost changed what it is that they're able to give and give so much more. But they never set out to have this big plan. They never had this big bang of we're going to make this big new future. They just kept reconstructing the now to make it a little better and more suitable so that people would stay in it, so that these countries would stay in it. And therefore, it would be there to construct a better future for them. And I think that's kind of a really important insight for us that, it's not the Big Bang, it's not this utopia. It's that if we think that thing can work, it may be very fragile, and we just have to keep working at the little pieces of it. And I think another thing that came out of it, and your talk, Anne, was this notion of like, what are the tools that we've got? And one of the pieces that we're doing at the moment is we're looking at, a country that is trying to move away from this dystopian future of, people being ravaged by disasters and having no financial protection. And what are they going to do about that? And the policy tool comes up with something that really doesn't solve that problem. It maybe solves a small piece of that problem. But in the process of consulting about it, all these other possibilities come up.
Yeah.
And we sort of see them, they're not acted on, but they're shadow futures that are also there. And actually, Anne's work gave me hope, and I felt optimistic because I'm like, so it's not a perfect solution. It's a solution that's navigating between many different desirabilities where people kind of can't see themselves in some, that one's come up, some people can't see themselves out. This one's come up, but this one, it's not good enough for anything, but it is something. And I kind of feel like maybe that's a necessary. It's like our risk pools. We're doing something now, we're reconfiguring the now, which gives us something where we can reconfigure the now tomorrow, and tomorrow, a little bit like how your scenarios came up again. Oh, we went too far that way, but now we've got this other one. Let's go and find it. So I sort of feel like maybe there is more hope than like these big moments of disruption, these things like that, but maybe there's something out there that we can get hold of. And if we don't expect a big bang, but if we expect to work at little things in the now, we have to do something. I'm choosing optimism. I'm choosing hope.
And I know, and that brings it back to the first point. If the future is out there, then it's always distal, right? There's always this distance between, yet there's plenty of evidence that multiple people are working to reconfigure what's happening right now. And I think you shared an example yesterday.
I would love to share this example about the small things that can radically change the trajectory of the future. And I have the privilege of naming this inspiring winemaker, Oana Branzei, that has given us a tour of this winery that she constructed. She imagined and constructed more than 20 years prior to create wider spaces between the vines so that in case a fire would come, there would be time for the fire to be stopped. Sometimes the fire stops by itself if there are a lot of spaces because it loses momentum. In her case, it was giving the firefighters a place to fight the fire safely. And this beautiful location has become almost a pilgrimage area because there are wine lovers that stop over in this beautiful natural park to learn about the whole architecture of futures in winemaking. And of course, maybe for the wines too, the wines are wonderful, but the recipe is not just the making of the wine, but making more resilient wineries that are less prone to fire. And it so happened by giving the firefighters respite to fight this fire, it actually spared the community from being burned. And these are the small stories that sometimes are prescient, but more and more are replicable.
Yeah.
So the same way as we look at the scary patterns, the fearful patterns that inhabit or paralyze action, we can also find these small glimmers and recipes and blueprints of how we can act in ways that help us prepare for future disaster, helps us rebuild, helps us be safer.
And this, what I love about this example is we tend to think of we can only act once we have more information, right? If we think about all of us even teaching, right, our students, well, if more information and then we can have the answer, or, we can craft the desirable future. But what I love about what you said is 20 years ago, she thought through, well, I know a little bit about maybe how fires spread. And if I just add a little bit more space between the vines, right, which is a tangible, very small action as opposed to this big bang that we tend to look at. Paula, any examples from your, or you want to speak? Anne.
Well, I guess what I'm really wrestling with here, because both of you have just talked about like the anchoring of small changes in the now that actually can have important middle term and long term effects. It is a very near term future horizon, which is different than the case I was talking about in terms of like most scenario thinking as opposed to public interest or these kinds of socially oriented projects are focusing on the middle term. And it's not big bang either. So then there's like the long-term futures, but it's like I'm interested in this, the tension between moving back and forth through different temporalities. So in that early futures piece that I did early in my career on thinking about the cultural dimensions of projectivity, I talk about the way we need to think about the extension or the length of the extension of futures thinking, imagined futures into the short term, the long term, and the medium term. But then with what degree of detail or clarity are we imagining the futures of the short term and the medium term or the long term? How are we paying attention to contingency, which I think the fire thing is a great example, contingency. And that varies. If contingency looks really, if you're a weather forecaster, contingency in the long term is super different than contingency of the short term. So in terms of like, how complex interactions are going to happen, are going to play out, your forecasting models, your long-term weather forecasts are really different than the short term. But I would say when we're thinking about future making, the moving back and forth flexibly between the short term, the middle term, and the long term is important. So I definitely hear the point about the importance of the anchoring of futures in the present, but I also think that it's a back and forth between, expanding the temporal telescope and then sometimes contracting it again, moving back and forth between different temporalities.
And because they raise different dilemmas at different stages.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And so that's that oscillation, and it doesn't really matter which temporal lens, right? Short term, midterm.
Yeah, I mean, we have to develop that kind of temporal flexibility, the ability to move back and forth between different temporal horizons to inform our actions in the present, but as well as, what in this case of the Kenny of the Crossroads, like what will happen if you do economic modernization, but you don't intend to festering inequality. That's the short term, it's going to look great. You're going to have economic growth. You're going to boom. But in the middle term, is that going to generate unrest and exclusion and tension that then could come back and disrupt the happy economic future that your industrialists were hoping for?
And Paula, in your work, do these temporal tensions come up?
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting point, and it's one of the things I struggle with to understand how can we get these powerful imaginings of what might look desirable and to whom, or how can we get people around the table? We were actually talking about this morning at breakfast, this notion of imaginaries, but then because if you can get an imaginary, you can get people around the table in the now to imagine themselves within that future at some level, so that, because there will be these trade-offs and things, but like, what is it that you're gaining as you losing, and I think that's something that we haven't really managed. We know it's got to be multi-party dialogue, we know it's got to be cross-sector, we don't, but actually all of these things are quite entrenched. Nonetheless, I feel listening, like, actually, maybe we already have a lot of this in our societies, in the stuff that I'm looking at. We know that we have climate science. We know that we have people who are looking at these inequities and things like that. We know that people who are very, strongly committed to, but, you can only make it through current prosperity. We have to stick where we are. So maybe we have these things, but what we're missing is maybe a little bit more of that flexibly moving between them to say, yeah, this is in the now, this is in the middle, this is in, and how do we move back and forth between them so that we negotiate those interstitial spaces in which we want different types of transformation? Because I think I don't think we need more tools or more knowledge. We need to know how to make more use of this knowledge.
It's a different way of thinking about time travel, actually.
Yeah.
So you're not actually going back in time, but you're telescoping back and forth between different horizons.
And I love that you're making it feel so smooth
No, it's
and
not smooth.
and flowing, almost like a dance. But we
Yes,
have
yeah.
borne witness to some of those choppiness and lumpiness. And being a truth teller, right? When you're a harbinger of the ozone layer being depleted or the corals being bleached is hard work because you are foretelling highly undesirable futures. And then those that are at the receiving end of those futures would rather not hear the story for as long as possible. So there are some very difficult to cross liminal zones, buffer zones, especially when we're confronting this hard to acknowledge assumption. And yet, because we have this amazing example of the ozone layer in which there was a collective will to confront, and there is the proof that it was a reversible step. So if we can take a little bit of hope that even when that telescoping back and forth is really hard to do, the ability for us to do it at critical mass, as close to possible to real time, it gives us a fighting chance to reverse some of the damage done.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry, I just see that we just have I'm just cognizant of time. We're a little bit ahead of time here. We have about 15 minutes left. So if anybody has any questions, I do see quite a few questions. So I just wanted to chime in before I get to the questions. What I find really interesting about all of this is, the one paper that I do have on future making is in a much simpler context, right? We looked at it, and what we realized when we went in was we wanted to discover change. So we were looking for this big bang. We were looking for this notion of what is the thing, but in those simple beginning conversations where they were trying to project out, what does the future look like? What are we talking about? It was so abstract. There was so much ambiguity,
Right.
yet they could come
Right.
with something very tangible, and nobody actually decided this in the change process, but they came up with something like scheduling meetings in a software that everybody has access to, which began to shift and shape. And so it's almost like it's so difficult sometimes to deal with that ambiguity, right? That it's this moving back and forward that they didn't even realize at the time, right? That they were actually doing things a little bit differently. So to kind of link back to the point that Paula made earlier. And so,
And I liked your paper, actually. If I may say so, we have drawn.
I love your paper on future making.
It's a cool paper.
well, thank you. I have a question here specifically about the differences between committed firefighters and then changing trajectories. So where's the accountability and agency, and how does agency come into this? And we can.
Oh, in so many ways, in all the ways, in different, very small and pretentious steps and projections and landscapes and all forms of coordination that cross boundaries and cross climate, time, space. But all of these are extraordinarily sobering. So the firefighters have developed a way of speaking, not about what they're doing, but about what they know how to do. And they have developed a vocabulary about knowing climate events and knowing fire and knowing how the fire thinks. And that creates comfort with the discomfort, and it allows them to practice because they have very well-rehearsed practices, but it allows them to uphold the practicing in a context that can rapidly, in the nick of time, shift from under them.
And this question too is for you talking about who is the accountability and agent, even in your work. How do you see it coming up in these scenarios, right? You have all of these different people in the room. I realize like using scenarios, but how do you figure out what to do after?
I think that is a really good question that a lot of these the scenario projects don't really have answered, because what you've done is you've hopefully expanded, enlarged people's senses of what's possible. And you've talked about a couple of different possibilities, things to steer towards and against, but the question of linking this to responsibility or policy, you talked about policies or specific actions, is a lot more ambiguous. And I think that like the practitioners wrestle with how you go from this imagination-provoking deliberative processes to hit linking. So the hope is that individual people will have been changed by this process. They will have been enlarged by these conversations, and then they will take this enlarged understanding to whatever their own professional practice is, and this will help them. This will help collectively at a larger scale move towards the better futures and away towards. But I think the responsibility question is a good one. I think sometimes the responsibility comes out a little bit ambiguous. There's an ambiguity about the responsibility. That's something that I'm wrestling with. Like what is that? Because what scenarios do is I think about at least what could happen, hopefully to steer towards, what should happen, but the should is not as clearly articulated. If it's linked to a broader, the breaking open of the futures into a broader process of planning and action strategizing, then you have to get to the next step about linking that to responsible action.
And this is actually a nice segue to the next question about Paula's work and this notion of reconfiguring now, right? So this agency of possibilities, and how does it kind of come into keeping the stakeholders that need to be involved, right? And you even talked about in your book, right, involving the governments where maybe there are some gaps. So maybe you can speak to.
Yeah, look, I wish I had a really good answer for that. Then we wouldn't have a problem. But I do think there's a couple of things that, it's this notion of possibilities for action. And so I see that in some of the things that we set up, which are in themselves imperfect. They're imperfect solutions to a much bigger problem. They are nonetheless, they're already, sometimes you refer to them as they're a canary in a coal mine, so they're able to sing or stop singing and we can see them, Other times I think they kind of have an anticipatory function, like your scenarios. Do they have an anticipatory function in that they see what the problem is and they're creating knowledge about it, even if they're not able to act upon it, they're creating this body of things that there are moments where you can act. There are possibilities for action being created all the time. But then when is there moments where action can reconfigure a bit? So I think we need to be quite optimistic that we're creating a lot of possibilities for action. A lot of them can't be acted on in the moment. And that's quite frustrating. And that's frustrating for the people working in them and all of that kind of thing. But it's having that, and I think this is the really important thing, the courage of persistence to keep making those possibilities, because there's these moments. I mean, we call them we call it in our book a little bit, we're on the edge of disequilibrium all the time. And that edge of disequilibrium is actually quite powerful for being able to do something a little bit different. And there's always people wanting to put it back to, let's just go back to what we know. Like there's no disequilibrium. There's nothing, we have hit the guardrail, we're coming back. But if you accept, wow, we're on the edge of disequilibrium, all these possibilities for action have a chance to not bring us back, but reconfigure the new. And I trying to be optimistic. That's the point of our book, that you can reimagine it, right? That you can reimagine it. But to do that, you have to have imagination and you have to be able to do the which is to move from where we are to something new. To reproduce is not to produce in the same way.
And the question behind that, and you've answered it nicely, and then I'll let Oana chime in as well, is what is the motivation for action? And it's almost like being on the edge of disequilibrium.
Say that 3 times fast.
Yeah, exactly. It can be part of the motivating forces, right, behind this kind of change. And so, Oana, I saw you.
Yeah, but even the landscape of expectations. I have read your book, and I hope that it will become mandatory reading for everyone in the insurance industry. Because once you have read the book and you have the deep history of the sector, for 49 countries, 17 initiatives, it becomes impossible to hold on to the expectation of fundamental incompatibilities between markets and disasters. It behooves one to change, to update expectations. And once those expectations are updated, the conditions of possibility update as well. So configurations of action in the now, before and after reading the book may be fundamentally different, because we have gone unearthing and resettling and recultivating some of those fundamental assumptions. And to me, that is transformational, to be able to think about markets and nature, to be thinking about natural disasters and forms of collective action in the same sentence, in the same thought. think that is a reconfiguration to me as a reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just have like 5 more questions, and I noticed that we have 10 more minutes, so I'm going to try and so back actually to Anne, where people really do want to discuss this notion of scenarios and we're imagining, but actually I think what the question is saying is, can we link the imagining and making, right? So we're talking about imagining and making almost like, can we use scenario for making as well? Or are there tools in our toolkit that some are maybe perhaps better for imagining and others are better for making? And do we see these as distinct, or are they part of the same process, right? The process ontology of making futures, or are they actually distinct?
Well, I mean, very few people are just doing scenarios right now. And so usually they're part of broader problem consideration of problem areas or challenge areas. I think that the scenarios are useful for thinking in, like this future is like a somewhat of a safe space removed from the day-to-day that you can play with different possible pathways, and that can be kind of liberating for thinking about what is possible or what we're seeing around corners as to what could happen. So it's almost like it's like a play space. It's like in the imagination, things haven't yet happened yet. So you can, it doesn't mean that the play is always fun, because sometimes the futures you think about, really plausible bad futures, and that's important to imagine that as well. But it's still a safe space in which people who have really quite different perspectives can consider diverse outcomes. But if you are going to link that to action, it is just like one part of it. It's like how there's the foresight part of it, but you link that to thinking about specific actions. Like it's a different kind of thinking, different kind of space. You've got to think about institutions. You have to think about opportunities and threats within your particular field of action. You got to think about particular roles. You have to think about distributions of responsibility, who's going to do what. Got to build institutions.
And this links nicely to your work, Paula, about even just different stakeholders.
Yeah.
Right. So even today we had a seminar on earlier work before this current one about this interest in pluralism, stakeholders, who's sitting at the table, and maybe that's part of.
Yeah, and I think this kind of legitimacy of the different interest groups and accepting that, because these are pluralistic solutions. They have to be, and I think this is part of your point. Like the solution is pluralistic, and obviously there's power effects, and I'm not trying to deny any of that. But it's if we accept pluralism genuinely, then we accept that the different stakeholders have different legitimacies, but sources of power with which to make their legitimacies felt. And they will make them felt one way or another over time anyway. For example, your inequalities that came out, you suppress one thing, it doesn't go away. In fact, in some ways, it becomes more legitimate because it was not attended to. So it's kind of working out these different interests and accepting that. I mean, this is a very utopian thing to suggest, isn't it? That if we accept that all of those are legitimate and that all of them need to have at least some part of them met, then we can maybe keep moving forward like this with your trade-offs, but we keep moving like this rather than going, oh, over here, oh, over there. Disequilibrium 1, disequilibrium 2. How do we?
Right. It's the oscillation, which is sometimes really destructive. Like we say, oh, this future is bad. Let's take this one. But you forgot that the competing imperatives are still in play, and you can't just block. You can't just block a whole set of perspectives and hopes and grievances and claims on standing for future life.
And yet the tensions persist, right? So this is the other theme that's kind of come through, is we live in a world of ambiguity, and those tensions persist, and it's kind of making our way through towards, right, in spite of, as opposed to, we're not trying to eradicate, right? We try and examine them, a dilemma, a paradox, whatever your lens that you take to this, it's a persistence.
And maybe not in spite of, maybe because of. It's a bit like walking, if you think about it, isn't it? Oscillating is, maybe that's how you create movement.
Sorry, what are you?
I think this is a beautiful question, because we often think we imagine in order to act, or we act and therefore we reimagine. But I think this is a complex and not a foregone conclusion, because there are very different patterns of pluralistic engagement in imagination, very different in collective action. very different tragedies, very different lapses, very different consequences. And I think it behooves us to think a little bit more about when we couple and when we decouple imagination and action. And I think the scenario exercises are in some fundamental way a decoupling.
They are,
So
which
that
is
they
useful.
create,
It is a useful moment.
yeah, so they create a little bit of spaciousness about how do we pause and think about the futures. In our work, we have this window in between generations of fire that creates the spaciousness of dialogue and thinking and questioning assumptions. And sometimes it doesn't have to be long. It just, you talk about that pre-liquidity before the drought happens, even a few days, it can be a shaper. But I think I don't think it's so straightforward and we think and therefore we act, or vice versa. I think it's a complex and worthwhile question to ponder.
And just for the sake of time, we have 3 minutes left. So maybe closing thoughts. There were questions of hope in here as well. So maybe that's kind of where we'll lead, right? Sometimes we can get overwhelmed, particularly with the events that are happening in the world today, elections, wildfires, floods, all of these things can be quite draining on our emotional reserve. So kind of tethering that forward, right? Anticipating, recognizing there are some undesirable outcomes. So how do we really thoughts about that kind of navigating towards the hopeful?
Hope flourishes in hopeless settings, right? So we throw that hope in the air when we don't have anything else to climb on. And I think that is a time now with the planetary boundaries, with the extreme events, that we need hope more than ever. And the way hope holds is because of the collective imagining, because of the collective action. It's because hope creates those boundaries and bounded spaces where possibilities can reemerge. We can begin again.
And Paula?
Yeah, so I'm going to do hope from the opposite of this imagining, real practice scholar and mundane. The things that have given me hope most recently, and we're studying like this, how do you make Australia, which is so prone to disaster and climate exposed, more resilient? And the hope I'm getting is from actually studying professionals who are working on very small, they're redeveloping maps of risk, and they know that nobody wants to listen to these maps, and they still make these maps, and they're going to make these maps so good. And somewhere these maps are going to be a reason to not build there. Not today, because today no one wants to hear that.
Sure.
But they're just still going to build that map, and I know that one day that map will be the source of let's not build there. And I look at these people who are doing, mundane things, but they are willing to keep persisting in the face of things that, as I said, courage, persistence, everyday practice. I wish I was better at everyday practice than I am at studying it. Yeah.
Oh, I was asked this question yesterday about where I have hope. It's a difficult day to ask me about hope. You can ask me tomorrow, or if we'll have a better sense of how hopeful I'm feeling or not about, will we get the, but even the election outcomes will be an interesting marker. But beyond that, hope is a rope. You throw the rope into the air, and it's anchored in what? In nothing. It's just thrown into the air. And but I think it's like the hope is also grounded in where you're standing. So it's where you're standing and what you're tossing into the air. It's like that back and forth. So our ability to keep throwing the rope, even while we're seeing the the threat, forms of suffering and trauma. We were talking about trauma, those are, those are real. And yet people, I study social movements, people, resist, invent, create, co-create new forms of action. And that is part of what makes us human. That's part of what human agency is. It isn't just about repeating the past. It's also about finding ways to make new beginnings.
And that is a beautiful note, and time is telling me this is the time to end as well. So thank you for joining, and we will make this available online once in a couple of days. So thank you.